Namaste. As we move on to part two of our profound discussion on Nietzsche's horses, we need to see how things have changed from our part one discussion to part two, as we talked about the background, the personality, and the psychoanalytic understanding of the personality's creation. So, somewhere in our part, we had discussed about how Nietzsche's personality had a deep impact on the philosophy which he created, and vice versa. But we were also somewhere at the life's most tragic event, the triggering event, that of the witnessing of the horse death. So, what is the symbolic interpretation with regard to psychoanalysis, with regard to Nietzsche's own personality and his background?
Psychoanalytically, to recap, Jung had the idea that Nietzsche was drowning in the archetype of the old wise man. Some other Jungians posit, and I feel that is more correct than Jung himself, that if we give an archetypal explanation, it is more possible that he was drowning in the hero archetype in a primary way rather than in the old wise man archetype. But psychoanalytically, apart from the Jungian interpretation, there's something else. As I said, my own interpretation is based upon the ideas of the Valley Junction model, based upon early life object laws. And then from there, the continuing series of events till the midlife. And it was in the midlife crisis that the circle got completed. The circle of pathology. And the horse is very symbolic, because horse is also the healthy part of Nietzsche. The healthy part of Nietzsche, the powerful part of Nietzsche, the masculine part of Nietzsche, the energetic, struggling part of Nietzsche that kept him going. And when he saw the horse die, it coincided with the death of the horse inside of him also. So despite all the pathology of early life object loss, split open, a fragile ego, narcissism and schizoidal personality disorders developed because of the Valley Junction phenomena, frustration of a non-appreciative, non-reciprocating life, loneliness and frustration of the emotional life, and then the midlife. It was in the midlife where I think the midlife was the last straw on the camel's back, the last straw on the horse's back here, and the horse collapsed.
Right.
It also brings up very interestingly the aspect of masculinity. Because the horse also symbolizes masculinity. And I'm sure deep at some level, there was a crisis of masculinity in Nietzsche, which found expression in a compensating character of the overman, the superman.
Yes.
So philosophically, as relevant and as precious the concept may be, psychoanalytically, it may be an act of compensation simultaneously. The important aspect here is what keeps you going and why does it stop at some point? Why can't it keep you going for another 10 years? Why should Nietzsche collapse at 44 and not at 64? And why not at 24? What took him from 24 to 44, why it could not take him further to 64? So this brings us to this entire element of the midlife, that the resignation, the disappointment and resignation was so deep that once such a deep resignation happens, and usually it happens after midlife, especially for very talented people who have been frustrated in life, that no hope is seen in the external world. And when you say goodbye to the external world, you do not have a healthy internal world to go back to. And therefore you drop into the chaos of psychosis. And that dropping into the chaos of psychosis at this point is usually fatal. Usually you don't recover. Now this is in
But
contrast.
sorry for interrupting. I just couldn't hold on to my curiosity. When you say about the fragile psyche, right, or the weak psyche, but when you were talking about the only few sentences he spoke, it seems to be all happy zone there. And it seems that he regressed into his own fantasy world of true world, where everything is so perfect.
So this also
So
brings us to the point of the regression of the narcissist.
exactly. There
That,
he has created good books, and his narcissism and schizoidal self is being, served right. And so the death of horse can also be death of the operational world, and then regressing back to the fantasy world of a narcissist, to the primal state.
uh, right, because the happiness that you see in Nietzsche occasionally is symbolic of, not symbolic, it's communicative of regression to the state of primary narcissism. So the good part was that if not completely, at least partially, Nietzsche had regressed to the state of primary narcissism, and that often is a blissful state.
Blissful state, exactly.
And therefore, we don't see that agitation, that
Hmm.
struggle in Nietzsche after the regression.
Yeah, because many times a catatonic patient would be in a very painful or rageful state, whereas here he's silent and in bliss state.
So when you say goodbye to the outer world, where you go back to? If you have a healthy inside, you can still go to the healthy inside, and you can still be creative in the inner world. But if you say goodbye to the outer world and you don't have a good inner world, you either drop into the chaotic psychotic world, which often is persecutory,
Right.
or you regress to the state of primary narcissism, the oceanic oneness.
Oceanic ones.
And the good part is that Nietzsche had largely regressed to the state of oceanic oneness. He never got violent. He never felt persecuted or deluded that somebody is going to come and attack him. It was only
Even while
for
people was looking at him in the auditorium, it could have been very triggering for catatonic people, where they're buying tickets and coming to look at him while he remains silent and comfortable. So he's getting the audience what a narcissist would like in his own world. It's just I'm just trying to figure out the visual aspect of how it must be. You triggered a lot of curiosities in me. So sorry for interrupting.
The only time when Nietzsche seems to have been in a slightly persecutory open split stage,
Okay.
where the classical persecutory phenomena, aggressive phenomena, they take hold of the mind, was a few days after this event of the horse, where Nietzsche
Okay.
wrote letters to some of the friends, which brought out aggression and persecution and fantasies related to it. But
So somewhere it was a transitional state to prior to that primary narcissistic state.
correct. So having said goodbye to the world with the death of the horse, it was the horse in him which was connecting to the outer world died. The horse inside was his postman to the outer world. The messenger died, and then there was a vacuum. He had withdrawn from the outer world. The horse also is symbolic of the hope. The horse is not only symbolic of a healthy self, not only symbolic of his masculinity, not only of his strength, but also of hope. With that, the disappointment and resignation went absolutely to the bottom, and the hope died. And once the hope died with the horse, the inner horse died, and a complete withdrawal started, a regression started. And the first state of regression was the classical state of split, aggression, persecution, chaos, disintegration. That continued for a few days, but after he was admitted to the asylum, the regression did not stop there. It went deeper, and fortunately, it went into largely into primary narcissism. The good and bad part about this is, the good part is the suffering is not there. You are largely in peace, occasionally in bliss. The difficult part is it's very difficult to retrieve anyone from this. From a therapy standpoint, one can more easily deal with a delusion of persecution, the split open, the aggression, than with somebody who has gone into primary narcissism. Because one of the difficulties not only is of the degree of regression, but the deal that you are offering.
Absolutely.
You are asking the person to give up the oceanic
Peaceful, blissful.
oneness and bliss in return for a half-satisfying neurotic world, full of challenges and disappointments. So it's not an easy deal to negotiate. And most of the times we fail as therapists. But the good part is that the psychosis was a happy psychosis. Largely a happy psychosis. So this is one aspect of Nietzsche's regression. And therefore, even after moving from asylum to his home, he was largely peaceful, which is very different. You can see two complete withdrawals in different ways. There can be a catatonic withdrawal, which might be because of envy or anger. And you can see the agitation in the person who, with great effort, is controlling that agitation. And you can see the complete withdrawal of a person into oceanic oneness and the state of primary narcissism, who is largely peaceful and blissful, occasionally blissful. So we see in Nietzsche the multiple symbolizations of the horse as a symbol for Nietzsche's hope, his strength, his healthy self, his ego strength, his ego cohesion, his aggression, his masculinity, and all of it dying together in a single event, which is where the collapse happens of all the bridges with reality are undone, and a complete collapse into the self happens. But inside there is nowhere to go. So the only place one goes back to is psychosis of a very deep type. And this is where the symbolism of the horse is very important. That the healthy self, it was like, it was a very big cart of pathology, which was still pulled on by the horse, till the horse could pull on. And when the hope died, the horse collapsed. So Nietzsche's horse is a very symbolic entity in explaining Nietzsche's inner life and his enigmatic collapse into senility.
So when we talk about the world of philosophy and the great philosophers like Nietzsche, was Nietzsche's alone, or have there been other great thinkers with their own dead horses or some symbolic versions where the life took a different direction for them?
It's a very good question. In fact, there are many great thinkers who had their own versions of horses. In most cases, the horse did not die, it got weak, it got sick, it got old, or it took a turn. The horse lost its strength in most cases, where after a particular point they could not produce anymore like they used to produce before. So the horse got old and sick. And that you can see in many philosophers who produced great works. And after a point, rest of their life, they could not produce an equally great work. You can also see a turn horse takes in case of many thinkers, where the early part of the thinker and the late part of the thinker produce very different things.
Different.
Take, for example, Heidegger. Early Heidegger and late Heidegger are very different. Take Wittgenstein. Early Wittgenstein and late Wittgenstein are very different. Take, for example, Lacan. Early Lacan and late Lacan are very different. Take, for example, Wilfred Bion. Early Bion and late Bion are very different. Take even Freud. Early Freud and late Freud are very different. So in their cases, in some cases, the horse was strong but took a turn. In some cases, horse went weak, and after some time, they could not produce any more or of that quality that they produced once, which is true of Immanuel Kant. The best he could produce was one. Schopenhauer, the best he could produce was one book. And then later, things was just commentaries. For Nietzsche, we can see very clearly that after midlife, he could not produce much, and he actually went into senility. For Hegel, it was once the phenomenology of spirit. So the horse going weak, the horse taking a turn is very common. The horse dying and the thinker sliding into senility is very rare. You see that in case of Nietzsche, you see that in case of Van Gogh.
Okay.
That the horse takes Van Gogh to some point and then takes a violent turn. But compared to Nietzsche, Van Gogh was not as lucky. So when Van Gogh withdrew from the real world, like Nietzsche, he did not have a good inner world to go. But Nietzsche had one place to go, the state of primary narcissism. Because very early in life, he must have experienced a very good being at the breast before the object loss happened.
Before the split.
Before the object loss happened, he would have experienced the good breast, the good mother, which Van Gogh probably did not. So when Van Gogh regressed, he went into that aggressive persecutory state in which he shot himself. So his horse also collapsed, but he was not as lucky as Nietzsche was to go back to the state of primary narcissism and have caregivers still give care to him. He was even more alone than Nietzsche was. So we see this phenomena quite pervasive, and it brings us to a point that it's very rare to find a healthy genius. Usually, genius is accompanied with some pathology or the other. And this brings us to the larger point of purpose of pathology, which we have discussed before in another discussion.
Yes.
In fact, this finding that it's rare to have a healthy genius goes long back to Socrates. Socrates used to say, it's rare to find a great mind without a touch of madness. So it's quite a common phenomena, and it's a tragic phenomena. In some great thinkers, it's more tragic than others.
So having listed them all together reminds of many more. So was Nietzsche's a precursor to Freud, Adler, or Sri Aurobindo?
Yes, yes. Before that, let me just uh, put a remark of how Jung analyzed him. And there is something to be said here. Jung was greatly fascinated by Nietzsche. In fact, he analyzed in detail Nietzsche's sickness. And in general, he was hostile to philosophers. And much of it had to do with his own inability to really grasp the value of the philosophy, independent of the sickness of the mind which was producing it. So he got into that process of devaluing the product of a sick mind because it is a partially sick mind, which is not true. The mind which is producing great things may be partially sick, but also it is partially healthy to produce it. And what it produces is independently valuable. Independent of the thinker, it is valuable. So then it acquires a value of its own and it stays for centuries valuable, which Jung could not see, could not understand. And he thought it was overwhelming by the old wise man archetype. And he produces the free association evidence by saying that when Zarathustra comes down, he first meets the old wise man. And this produces in Nietzsche that manic high, that schizophrenic high, which is also evident according to Jung in the pages of the book Thus Spake Zarathustra, and also in the idea of the overmind. So in Jung,
Isn't it in that way, when the man travels down back to the mountain and meets the old wise man, and Jung is right in a way where he was in the transitional phase of psychosis, where he was in the, the delusion of persecution and everything together and aggressive. Later, he went into the primary narcissism. So that state can be that transition of the man meeting the old wise man, and then the hero comes as a narcissistic primal state.
Jung puts it the other way. He posits that the drowning in the old wise man archetype was the reason for psychosis.
Yeah, the initial reason, but then there is more of regression into it.
That he doesn't go into.
Okay.
For Jung, that is the only core issue.
Okay.
That is how he explains. But another explanation could be in Jungian terms, in archetypal terms, is that the hero archetype was at the peak. So the first drowning was in the hero archetype. The second drowning was, the deepest drowning was in the hero archetype. Sorry, the deepest drowning was in the self, where the oceanic experience of the oceanic oneness, the experience of primary narcissism would take place. So the deepest drowning was in the self. The second deepest drowning was in the hero archetype. The third deepest drowning was in the old wise man archetype. This would be the alternative archetypal explanation of his crisis. So this is what there has to be said, that Jung had his own problems, and his explanation can be bettered, and it's not a very comprehensive or an accurate explanation. And part of it has to do also with his innate dislike of philosophers and inability to separate philosophy from the pathological component in the mind of the philosopher. and not valuing the healthy part of the mind of the philosopher. Now coming to the question that you said, was he a precursor to many of the great thinkers? Yes. Nietzsche was precursor to Freud because, like Schopenhauer, he continued with the idea of the unconscious. Schopenhauer used to say, men feel they are drawn from in front, but in fact they are pushed from behind. And the one who pushes them from behind is the will. There is a will behind the existence, that the existence should exist. And it is this will which makes possible existence to exist and go on as it goes on. And the same is true for the human system, that behind our desire to survive is a will to survive and a will to reproduce. So Nietzsche was a precursor to Freud in the idea of the unconscious. Nietzsche was a precursor to Alfred Adler in the idea of primacy of power in human constitution. Nietzsche was also a precursor to Sri Aurobindo in the idea of the Superman and the supramental manifestation. So Sri Aurobindo talks about brilliant intuition of the madman, often referring to the brilliance of Nietzsche, even as he was half psychotic. So when we look at the history of human ideas, Nietzsche is a precursor to Freud, Alfred Adler. He is a precursor to Sri Aurobindo, and he is also a precursor to postmodernism, which postmodernists refuse to accept. This idea that there is no one truth with capital T, and truth is what people make out of it, and there is no absolute authority, a gold standard to which it can be indexed or from which it can flow. Now, that flows from Nietzsche's concept of God is dead and man is free. So Nietzsche is a precursor in the history of ideas to many great thinkers and many great schools. Unfortunately, few have the humility and the sincerity to owe to Nietzsche what they really owe to him.
It has been a wonderful discussion. Hope our audience enjoyed it too. See you all again. Thank you, Dr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste.
Namaste.